So as introduced, I'm Nicholas Zegre. Depending on when I know people from, I'm known as Nick, Nico, or Nicholas. So you can call me anything. And after spending 8 years in the military too, I've learned to answer to just about any machination of my last name. So don't worry about how you call me. But today I want to share a story with you that's situated around hope and how colleagues of mine and I are working to facilitate hope among the climate crises here in West Virginia. These pictures here are pictures from the 2016 flood, and there's a lot in a picture, and we heard the importance of observations and pictures earlier today. And so this is what the climate crisis looks like here in West Virginia and here in Appalachia. So why, what is hope? Why is hope important? And probably the question you're asking yourself is, why the hell is a hydrologist talking about hope? I have been trained with many earth scientists to see the world through math and physics. But what we know is we're in a challenging place, and we also need to move forward. And if there is one characteristic that describes Appalachians is the ability to put one foot in front of the other, despite the challenges. So if I were to talk about flooding and hydrology and water resources a year or two ago, I largely would have focused on how my lab's research program is using numerical models to understand what happens to our water resources when deforestation happens, when mountaintop removal happens, with changes associated with climate change. And largely, what's wrong with the world? What's wrong with the world in terms of how we're challenged by how our use of Earth's natural resources are affecting us. And the goal would be to use this despair as a means of motivating other scientists to do work, as a means of motivating citizens to vote in their best interests. And this is the approach that I've taken for years in the classroom, where I teach classes on hydrology and water resources, watershed management, and increasingly around climate and environmental justice. But I have learned that this story of shouting doom really doesn't work, and it actually is not helpful. It does not provide a means of moving the world forward. So during the pandemic, Mike Jones and I earlier were talking about this. During the pandemic, we were teaching online, virtually. So there's a disconnect of human relationships. And when we first got back to the classroom, we were talking about what's wrong with the world. And students had lots of questions of how are we to move forward. And a lot of their questions were focused around this notion of despair. And so when I was talking about current events such as floods and wildfires, pollution, racism, inaction, misinformation, dysfunctional governments, war, terrorism, it became so evident how exhausted we all really are and how exacerbated we are. And really a common sentiment was that we're screwed and that we can't do anything. There is no point, and it's a sentiment that seemingly is shared across much of society, and in particular across youth who are inheriting a future that is different than what they were likely expecting. And so this presentation is going to explore how we're learning about hope and resilience through our work on flooding and climate change and vulnerability, and also planning for an uncertain future. But it's also talk about how we can move the world forward by situating our science, our education, and our outreach by including other forms of expertise. Expertise is a really heavy word, and we've had a very narrow perspective of what expertise is. But if we're going to move West Virginia forward, we need to diversify who has a say in what matters and what needs to happen. And so that's what this talk is going to be about. Preparing agents of change for tomorrow. And this is a project that I'm going to describe later on in the talk about how we're learning to move the needle on the climate crisis here in West Virginia. I'd like to acknowledge my colleagues who I'm grateful to also call friends. Megan Kruger from WVU Extension, Grace Dever, and Kennedy Lawson and Bradley Wilson from the WVU Center for Resilient Communities. We are on this together. The work that I'm describing represents this work that we're doing. Hopefully you can see this picture, but this is a picture of a flood. And it's important to ground our conversation today with why, research around flooding is so important, and importantly, why scientists such as myself need to continuously ask ourselves who I think I'm doing work for, and then who I'm actually doing my science for and doing my research for. Is it to improve livelihoods, through this land grant mission that institutions like WVU have, or is it to win grants just to do more science, to perpetuate doing more science? Flooding is the most prevalent, quote, natural, unquote, hazard, and is the leading cause of disaster-related deaths globally. Floods across the globe, floods affect about 2 billion people, which is about 23% of the global population. And as many of us have been experiencing, flooding is getting worse, largely due to a warming atmosphere that is resulting in more intense precipitation. Appalachia certainly is no different, is no different from other places in the world. And from a scientific perspective, the effects of flooding are pretty easy to explore through models. But flooding is also about conversations, about places, about people, and about livelihoods, about communities, and also about economies. It's also stories about survival, lived experiences, hope, and solidarity. This is a quote from 2010 floods in Harless Creek in Kentucky. He started crying on me. It was happening so fast. And I literally shook him, Bentley, his son, Bentley, the father. He said, "Son, listen, we are fighting for our lives now. You have to keep it together." This is where this science is situated, in real lives and real experiences. This is a picture from the Eastern Kentucky floods back in July 2022. There's so much in this picture. There's a river, there's a road, there's a a truck, but there's also a house, somebody's home, that's pushed up on a bridge, on a road that they probably travel indefinitely without thinking about anything besides that they got to get to work or get their kids to school. Yet somebody's home is pushed up on a bridge. Excuse me. So, floods are not equally distributed across the landscape. This is a map that shows flood risk for properties throughout the U.S. The darker the color, what we'll say dark blue, is upwards of 30% of the properties at the county scale are susceptible to flooding. This is work from the First Street Foundation. And what you can see very quickly is West Virginia, Eastern Kentucky, Western Virginia, what we'll call Central Appalachia, has the highest flood risk in the country. But the story doesn't stop there. Pollution, like flooding, is also unequally distributed across the landscape. We heard a lot about water quality issues earlier, and there are a couple of repeat pictures and slides here that we are going to look at. But a couple of years ago, the Natural Resource Defense Council published a study called Water Down Justice that explored drinking water violations, in particular the Safe Drinking Water Act violations, at the county scale throughout the U.S. And while they primarily focused on the likelihood of drinking water violations and associated with that race, we also know that systemic and structural issues with racism, as well as equity and access to resource, manifest across all sorts of people in the U.S. population. Here in West Virginia, while we're not racially diverse compared to other parts of the country, we have some of the highest rates of Safe Drinking Water Act violations in the country. And what this means is that West Virginia's drinking water, as we heard earlier today, shouldn't be assumed safe. In fact, from this report, 36 out of 55 counties in West Virginia were among the top third worst offenders for Safe Drinking Water Act violations. That translates to over 900,000 West Virginians were consuming water from drinking systems that were out of compliance with a federal law aimed at ensuring Americans have safe access to drinking water. Props to the West Virginia Rivers Coalition for all the work they do. This is the map that we saw earlier, and yeah, over 130 instances of community water systems in West Virginia that were detected positively for PFAS. But similar to flooding and similar to water quality issues, vulnerability is unequally distributed. Excuse me. Like so many of these issues that we're dealing with, procedural injustice excludes participation in the decision-making process and therefore excludes vulnerable communities from influencing a political economy that shapes their social safety. Marginalized and under-resourced and underrepresented communities have what we call pre-hazard precarity, meaning that even before a disaster strikes, they're starting from a place that often lack assets, often lack social protections. They're failing, or they, in many cases, are completely absent. As demonstrated by these recent headlines, there is a rightful distrust and mistrust of government and institutions that are responsible for governing. But there's also a rightful distrust of researchers and other experts that parachute in, treat communities as research subjects, extract information, tell communities what's wrong with them, what they should do, and then the researchers move on. This is a big problem for moving the needle on community resilience in West Virginia, in Appalachia, and everywhere. Now, West Virginia is no stranger to flooding. This picture at the bottom, which you may or may not be able to see, shows flood count data going back to the 1880s. And what you can see since the 1880s, West Virginia has always had floods. If you read the landscape and you see our hollers and our steep slopes and streams at the bottom, you know that we are in a flood, we live in a flood regime. Some notable floods are the Parkersburg flood of 1884, where you can see residents are paddling canoes almost at rooftop. West Union flood of 1939, Mullins in 2001, Gilbert 2009, Rainelle in 2016, and our more recent floods in Huntington in 2020, in 2021, 2022, and 2023. So trying to understand the flood problem in West Virginia, we went to the National Climate Data Center that NOAA runs, and we started asking questions of where are floods happening in West Virginia and what do they look like? And we took a recent flood history from 2007 to March 2022. And what we found is every single county in West Virginia has experienced floods. On average, at the county scale, there are about 30 floods during this time period in every single county in West Virginia. Since that fateful March 2016, there were 1,683 floods from 2007 to March 2022. But since that 2016 flood, there have been over 968 floods in West Virginia. In West Virginia, we have two types of floods that we're primarily concerned with. One is what we call riverine floods. And this is when a river or a stream exceeds its stream banks and spills onto land that is normally dry, what we normally call the floodplain. And these kind of floods operate on days to weeks. And they're the result of high rainfall and long duration rainfall that's saturating the landscape. And here's a very famous photo from the 85 floods. This is from the Cheat River. This is the St. George Bridge, which the 85 flood, the Great Flood, was a very characteristic riverine flood. And I was in this room 2 weeks ago talking to the West Virginia Watershed Association Network, and Rick Buckley, which I'm sure some of you know, actually pointed out that this was his aunt and uncle's cow named Buttercup that was washed downstream from the Slady area and ended up in the trestle. This is a picture of the riverine flood during the 2016 floods down on the Greenbrier. I don't know much about golf, so somebody correct me. But this is a photo from Bubba Watson of the first tee on the old white golf course at the Greenbrier Resort. On the left is Bubba Watson's photo. On the right is what that first tee looked like during the 2016 floods. We also have flash floods in West Virginia. And flash floods predominantly happen on small creeks and streams. They happen in urban areas or anywhere we have impervious surfaces. They often frequently happen outside of the floodplain. And this is important because in West Virginia, about 85% of our stream miles are headwater streams that don't have floodplains. We know that many of our residents live at the bottom of V-shaped valleys with a road cut into them, a road that was probably cut in our coalfields region by the coal industry to get workers to be able to extract their resources. Flash floods happen on the order of minutes to hours. And going back to the Kentucky floods in 2022, there are these harrowing stories of families having minutes to respond. Literally looking out their door, seeing a wall of water coming, turning, grabbing children, grabbing papers, grabbing pets and keys, and going out the door and being inundated and being swept downstream. Flash floods are West Virginia's greatest problem. This is a photo from Randolph County in 2019, and here is Lincoln County in 2021. We live with floods. Floods are everywhere, and they're getting worse. But as I mentioned earlier, floods are not equally distributed across the landscape. We took that National Weather Service data and conducted what we call a hotspot analysis to see where most floods are actually occurring. And when we think about floods through this lens of flash floods, we see that there are two hotspots in West Virginia. One largely focused around the West Fork River and the Bridgeport area, and the other one down in Kanawha and Putnam and Lincoln and Mason counties. But when we think about the riverine floods, these larger floods, they are predominantly happening in the Eastern Panhandle. And again, going back to landscape, we have different physiographic regions, we have different runoff generation mechanisms, so this isn't unsurprising. But what this does speak to is while we have floods throughout West Virginia, some places have a greater propensity to being flooded and impacted by those floods. So when we take that same data and plot it over time, count data of floods, we can actually see that flooding in West Virginia is on the rise. And I'd like to point to you, if you don't notice this point here in 2018, where there were over 260 instances of riverine floods in West Virginia. And a climate station that we run at WVU right outside of town here, Cooper's Rock, 2018 was actually the record year for rainfall for us. And so the question is, well, why are floods increasing? What's going on here? Really, the take home is warmer air temperatures mean more flooding. And so mechanistically, what's going on here? If there is one thing to understand about the climate crisis, is that warmer air holds more water. And whether you're living in the desert Southwest or here in Appalachia, that has huge implications for your well-being. The reason, again, going back to the mechanisms of what's going on here, is under a warmer atmosphere, the atmosphere expands. Kind of think about this like a balloon. And so if you blow up a balloon here in Canaan Valley in your house in January, and you're inside your house, you blow it up, let's say, Chip probably keeps his house at 65 degrees or so, walk outside into that Canaan Valley sideways sleet rain weather that we get down here, and what's going to happen to that balloon? It's going to shrink. And then what happens when you take that cold balloon and walk back in to the house? It's going to expand. This is how the atmosphere actually works. And so what this does is it means our atmosphere holds more water. There's simply more space for water to be held. Warmer air temperatures also increase evaporation from the forest, from our fields, from our wetlands, lakes, rivers, and the soil. And so not only can the atmosphere hold more water, but now there's more water going into the atmosphere. And this is what we would call a positive feedback loop. In fact, the relationship between air temperature and water vapor in the atmosphere is nonlinear, meaning that a small change in air temperature means a disproportionately large change in water vapor. This is a study that Climate Central came out with, I believe it was last year or the year before. What they show, which is well known, that a single degree Fahrenheit in air temperature translates to 4% more water in the atmosphere. So again, a small change in air temperature means disproportionately large amount of rainfall. And so this process is called water cycle intensification, where everything is moving faster. More water is being evaporated more quickly. More intense rain is happening more frequently. More runoff is flowing across the landscape. Stream flow is increasing and completing the cycle. And so in West Virginia and throughout the United States, extreme rainfall is increasing. These pictures are from May 2002 in the Huntington area. Is anybody from the Huntington area here, by the way? No? Okay. But what the Climate Central study showed was average hourly rainfall, the amount of rain that falls in each hour during a storm is increasing, has increased from 1970. In fact, Huntington has 28% more hourly rainfall now than in the 1970s. And so again, going back to the headlines that we may hear about flooding in Huntington, the observational record, this is not models. This is a rain gauge that has been analyzed, 28% more water in each hour of rainfall. And unfortunately, extreme rain is going to continue to increase because unless there's global consensus to decarbonize the global economy, we are going to continue to see warming. This map from First Street Foundation shows how extreme rain is expected to change we'll say early mid 21st century relative to the 1980 to 2000s period. And what you can see here in West Virginia, most of the state is projected to have about 5% increases in extreme rainfall. By 2050, that moves the entire state into a 10% increase in rainfall. And again, this is directly related to a warming atmosphere. This figure here shows the percent change in properties at risk for flooding in mid-21st century compared to current times, 2020. And so it's at the county scale, and the take-home is the darker the color, the greater the increase in properties at risk for flooding. So what you can see is Mingo and Kanawha and Wetzel and Doddridge and Taylor County are projected to have 40% more properties at risk of flooding by mid-21st century. This analysis also looked at infrastructure that we rely on for our quality of life, for our safety, for a healthy economy. And the study showed that 56% of West Virginia's fire and police stations are vulnerable to flooding. 46% of our roads that are used for egress, evacuation, responding to floods are themselves vulnerable to flooding. 38% of our schools and 37% of our commercial buildings. This is heavy. These are intense statistics. It's very overwhelming, and I need not have to convince you of that because, again, this has largely been a lived experience for many of us living here in West Virginia. So flooding is a challenging problem, and preparing humanity for more floods is even more challenging. It's easy to be overwhelmed by the scale and the complexity of the issue. And this leads back to that cycle of despair where we started. Despair leads to inaction, and this creates this negative feedback loop, what scholars call the cycle of doom. And so going back to that semester, that first semester that I was teaching back on campus after COVID, we were talking about flooding and wildfires and all these challenges that we're dealing with. And a student raised his hand and he said, Dr. Zeg, honestly, I have no hope for the future. This is a 20-year-old kid. He said, I have no hope for the future. Like, what's the point? What are we supposed to do about this? And then he looked at me and said, what are we supposed to do about this? And, you know, I was speechless. And he said, are you hopeful for the future? And I have 2 young children at home. And again, I didn't know what to say. And so I went home and I had a conversation with my family, my partner Sarah and our 2 kids. And I said, are y'all hopeful for the future? And they all were like, yeah. And I said, well, why? And Sarah said, because I'm hopeful. And I said, well, why are you hopeful? Where does hope come from? And so we had a conversation in the family. And what I'm going to talk about now is how we need to move forward, at least of how we're thinking about moving forward as a household, but also from organizations and institutions that are working for the betterment of humanity, such as the West Virginia Highlands Conservancy. And so my colleagues and I have come up with 4 action items which are not new to you in the room, especially the latter part that focus on organizing and advocating. But the first thing that has become evident is we need to situate all of our efforts around hope. And you may ask, like this student asked me, you know, what is hope? And so I went to some writing by Dr. Cornel West. Dr. West is a phenomenal thinker and writer. And I went back to his book, Hope on a Tightrope, which was published, you know, probably 15 years ago. And what Dr. West says about hope is about everybody trying to contribute to the push, to the motion, the momentum, the movement for something bigger than themselves. It's different than optimism, because optimism tends to be based on the notion that there's enough evidence out there that things are going to get better. And there isn't a whole lot of evidence that the climate crisis is going to get better. Hope looks at the evidence and says, it doesn't look good. It doesn't look good at all. But we need to go beyond the evidence, and we need to create new possibilities that allow people to engage in heroic actions, always against the odds, no guarantee whatsoever. Think about what the Conservancy has done since the 60s. Think about what West Virginia Rivers Coalition has accomplished in the 90s. Is that when y'all got started? In the 90s. So there is evidence that we can work together to create new possibilities. And that is what I mean by hope. And we need to think about how we build hope, that hope is intrinsic in everything that we do. Now, hope is imbued with a positive feeling about the future. And when that 20-year-old in my classroom told me he didn't have a positive vision or feeling about the future, it really got me thinking about what we're going to do. So it's only when we're hopeful and when we believe that we have a role to play will we actually act. So when I went back to my family and I said, what is hope to you and where do we receive hope? One consistent thing came to us, and that is the story of the cheat and the work that Friends of Cheat has been doing so tirelessly since that 1994 blowout. My family and I find refuge in the Cheat. This is my son Theo, who's learning to kayak there. This is my daughter Colette, who trusts the Cheat to submerge her entire body and swim to the bottom of the river. This is our family, being elated in the refuge of the Cheat. And we think about what Friends of Cheat has accomplished. The evidence of hope is palpable. It's tangible. It's right there. And the curious thing about hope is it's kind of like buying a red car. Once you identify hope, you start seeing it everywhere. You start asking friends of where they get hope, or students, or colleagues, or a family member. And eventually people will get to a story of hope. And West Virginia is in no absence of stories of hope, whether it's mine disasters, whether it's environmental pollution, whether it's floods, whether it's the opioid crisis. West Virginians have surmounted incredible odds to still put one foot in front of the other. And so going back to the cheat, Madison spoke to this earlier, but this is 1998. I can assure you I would not allow my children to submerge themselves in this river. This is 2022, where people are out enjoying the river, not even thinking about the history of what this place looked like previously. They have trust, they built trust that the cheat is a safe environment to be. So how do we go about sowing hope? When you unpackage hope, it turns out that hope requires agency. And agency is the belief that I am the cause for my own thoughts and action. Agency requires self-efficacy, one's own belief that they have control over events that affect their lives, but they also have purpose and can fulfill that purpose. Efficacy requires confidence. It requires knowledge of how the world works. Where do floods happen? Why are floods getting worse? What can we do about it? And so this process of sowing hope has become the philosophical and experimental framework in which my colleagues and I are working. How do we build pedagogies of hope that facilitate intergenerational learning, where everybody is an expert in their lived experience and can use that information to move the needle around flooding? The second point, youth are central to building climate resilient futures. Funny enough to see Corey in this room, maybe it was a year or two ago, Corey and I had a conversation around youth engagement that was in the Highlands Voice. And so hope is imbued with a positive feeling in the future. So anytime we're talking about planning, we have to implicitly think about the youth, because the youth are the future. There's a lot of hope by watching the actions of youth all across the globe that are organizing, that are demanding action to ensure that they have the future that they envisioned. Youth are doing what many adults in the room are not doing. And so in order to create a climate resilient future, we have to recognize and incorporate youth in the work that we're doing. Another source of hope is a study that colleagues and I conducted that was published last year. We were exploring climate change perspectives throughout Appalachia. We hear a lot of discourse about climate denial through Appalachia, but that discourse is largely promulgated by adults. And so we asked young adults from 6 Appalachian universities, from Western North Carolina, Kentucky, up into Pennsylvania, and then West Virginia, and also Virginia. And we said, do you think global warming is happening? And the results were promising. They're hopeful. 91% of the almost 500 students that were surveyed and interviewed with said, yes, of course it's happening. Look outside. We don't need models. We don't need scientists. We don't need peer-reviewed papers behind paywalls to know that climate change is happening. This is a lived experience. Then we asked, when do you think global warming will start to harm Appalachia? And this lot of stuff here, but this first one is they believe that they're being harmed now. 30% of respondents said, yes, it's harming us now. Over 10 years, 25 years, 50 years, 100 years, over 93% of those Appalachian young adults recognize that climate change is happening and is affecting them. I feel like I'm running out of time. Plenty of time? Okay. I forgot to set my timer up here, so. Sorry, let me just move forward here. So we are learning how to facilitate hope and how to engage with youth over hope through a project which we called PACT, P-A-C-T, Preparing Agents of Change for Tomorrow, building confidence for climate resilient futures in Appalachia. We're working with youth as leaders in their communities to develop flood resilience plans, to do the work that, again, adults in the room and in the state haven't been doing. And this approach is situated around things that I've already discussed of Appalachians have some of the highest risk to flooding in the country. But Appalachians, both youth and their communities, are excluded from the decision-making process. While we demand to be part of that process, we are often silenced when it comes down to rules that are being made and promulgated. But we also have this distrust of institutions and experts, which I discussed earlier. And so our approach to building hope, facilitating hope, and building flood resilient communities is really focused on this notion of each person in the room is an expert in their lived experience. Community members know what they need. Community members know what they don't have. Community members understand their assets, their strengths, their weaknesses. And so through a process of co-production, we are aimed at building new knowledge, new tools, new forms of data, new forms of technology, and importantly, new types of solutions to the climate crisis. And so this Preparing Agents for Change for Tomorrow is comprised of three different, what we're calling tiers, or three different levels of engagement. We're doing this work with 14 to 18-year-olds throughout West Virginia. We're working with the West Virginia Extension Service to go into classrooms through their school enrichment program. And we're developing curriculum around disaster and resilience literacy to build that foundational knowledge to set that chain from emotion, from efficacy to agency to hope. The second level is youth-led resilience planning, where the youth, again, are doing the work. And the third level is bringing these youth throughout the state that are doing this community resilience planning, and we're developing a youth resilience leadership summit and network. And I want to take a couple of minutes and talk about what each one of these are doing. So the tier one, the disaster and resiliency literacy, is using a tool that we developed with funding from the Appalachian Stewardship Foundation called West Virginia Climate Link. And this is the online interactive atlas that shows historic and future projected climate variables at the county scale throughout West Virginia. Users can look at air temperature changes, precipitation changes, days above heat thresholds, dangerous heat thresholds, days below freezing. And they can explore different aspects of climate, such as the existence, causes, consequences, and solutions to the climate crisis. But then they're working through learning activities that talk about what is community resilience? What does resilience look like? How can resilience be created and promulgated in your community? What are climate hazards? What are the drivers of flooding, and why is flooding getting worse? What does structural vulnerability look like in your community? What makes your community more vulnerable than, let's say, a community in the Northeast? Going back to the importance of stories, youth are interviewing their elders in their community to develop a repository of stories of resilience. Because like hope, once you have a story of resilience, once you understand what resilience is, you start seeing it everywhere. So youth are developing this repository of stories. And the goal of this first tier is working in the high school, in the classrooms, so each high school student leaves that semester with a household preparation plan to respond to flooding. The second level is resilience planning. And this is a youth-led mapping effort, a community mapping effort, where youth map the socio-economic indicators in their community or in their watershed. They look at landscape features that are important for flooding, land use changes, surface mines, roads, other impervious surfaces, critical infrastructure. Where are the bridges? Where are the culverts? How do we egress? How do we get out of the holler? How do we get to a place of safety? Hazard identification. Well, flooding is one thing, but what about the water treatment facility that in West Virginia are located next to waterways? Different hazards such as disruption electricity. What happens if EMS is flooded out? What can we do about that? Disaster preparedness. Okay, we have a household flood response plan, but what does that mean when we live in a community? Who in the community is on dialysis? Who needs medication? Who has generators? Who is infirmed or dependent upon wheelchairs? And they're collecting this information that is facilitated through our PACT program with the ultimate goal of developing a community flood resilience plan. And then those youth submit these plans to the West Virginia State Resiliency Office, which is charged with reducing vulnerability to flooding in West Virginia. Now, the State Resiliency Office has been working really hard, and they were given their mandate to fulfill an enormous mission after the 2016 floods. And despite how hard they're working, they have huge barriers that they need to get over. And so to date, West Virginia doesn't have a single flood resiliency plan. And so working with these youth who want to be leaders in their community, that want to stay in West Virginia, part of this process is, again, having them participate in the planning and decision-making process. And so the youth will lead community workshops in their community that brings the adults in the rooms and other people from the community to understand what people's needs are, what is missing from federal data sets and state data sets that people are using for decision making. And again, they are working with the State Resiliency Office to move this through. The third tier is this Youth Resilience Leadership Summit, where youth present to a larger community of public officials, scientists, decision makers, other professionals. One of our goals is workforce development around climate adaptation in Appalachia. Because if we don't do the work, nobody's going to do the work for us. And so we envision by empowering youth through this process of planning, of adaptation, that they will see the value in staying in their community. By working together, they'll learn about what vulnerability, but also what resilience looks like across the state in these different communities that may have different problems. As we know, the Tug watershed is very, very different from the North Branch of the Potomac. But importantly, these youth will be able to share their experiences and develop a network, a web of other youth that, as Mr. Rogers would say, look for the helpers. A network of other youth that are doing the work because they want a healthy future. They want to stay in West Virginia. Through this process, they'll participate in workshops around climate, around watershed management, adaptation, and resiliency planning, again, to create a Appalachian-ready workforce that's focusing on moving the needle forward. Now, the PACT curriculum is going to be bundled and distributed, publicly available, so organizations could use the three-tier network to do community resilience planning. Other institutions can use that. Our hope is to share it with our colleagues in Eastern Kentucky that we're working with around flooding. But the PACT curriculum, the way it's designed, is designed to surpass just flooding. We are in the process of adapting this curriculum to look at food insecurity, working with youth who in the state of West Virginia are the ones who largely go hungry. We're looking about how this PACT program of planning can be used for developing healthy communities that have access to healthcare, for energy, and the list goes on. So what else? We need to demand action, and of course you all know what it means to demand action. Related to flooding, Governor Justice signed the West Virginia Flood Resilience Law, SB 677, back in March. And this is huge. This requires the State Resiliency Office to create a new flood plan, which, by the way, our current flood plan was released in 2004 and wasn't even thought of until the 2016 floods. Every 2 years, the SRO will need to update the flood plan. It also importantly establishes 2 trust funds to have funding to move the needle on flooding. The first one is the Flood Resiliency Trust Fund, which will be used for communities to adapt, to build infrastructure, to implement nature-based solutions to mitigating these high-intensity rainfalls that we're experiencing. And the other one is the West Virginia Disaster Recovery Trust Fund, which provides funding, post-disaster for people to rebuild. Now, the problem is these need to be funded. And that should be no surprise that they haven't been funded. I do think it's tragic in a time of surplus that no inkling of this has been funded, but we really need to demand our decision makers implement this. The SRO has done tremendous work on thinking about what flood planning could look like. And if the trust funds are funded and the flood plan is followed, West Virginia has the potential for leading the country in thinking about how to adapt to more extreme rainfall. And speaking to the choir, but important to say, this year's Fall Review is a celebration of water, so I want to situate action within the water lens. And so we need to take action at the state level. And we heard from Angie, and we're all familiar with the great work that the West Virginia Rivers does in collecting ideas and needs and promulgating policy down in Charleston. We need to take action at the watershed scale. We all live in watersheds. And West Virginia has over 54,000 miles of creeks, streams, and rivers. And so if you're not involved with your local watershed organization, you should be. And the West Virginia Watersheds Partnership has this really wonderful dynamic map, if you go to their webpage, where you can find a watershed organization near you. So I do remember that while we're advocating and taking action around healthy forests, around preservation, around conservation, around all these needs, it's really important that we all speak together and work together. And then, of course, at the individual scale, we each need to be an advocate. And we all have different strengths and different skills and different passions. And so it's important for you to situate your advocacy in what you do well and what keeps you motivated. You all know in the room how exhausting the work is. But what we can see from your organization, but also importantly, Friends of Cheat and West Virginia Rivers, keep putting one foot in front of the other to make progress. And to go back to what Angie said, it's incremental progress. Incremental progress is the approach that we have to rely on. So just a couple of closing thoughts. Creating healthy, just, equitable, and vibrant communities for an uncertain future means that despite the overwhelming challenges, we can't give up. We have to keep moving forward. We are all experts, and therefore we all should participate in the decision-making and resilience planning. Everybody has something to bring to the table, so all of these experts and lived experiences need to be heard and need to be considered. You can't forget about the youth. The youth are the future. They need to be included and they need to be listened to. They don't need to be extracted from and just put on an advisory board or, futz with some activity that is really fun and easy to do. The youth want to do the hard work, but they need to be treated as collaborators in generating and producing new knowledge and new approaches to this uncertain future. And again, there are ample reasons to be hopeful. I encourage you to find your own reasons. Again, like a red car, when you buy one, you start seeing hope. When you put the filter of hope on, you start seeing it everywhere. And hope really is a fuel to keep us moving. And so seek out examples of hope within your households, within your families, and within your communities. And importantly, talk about that. Because the more we talk about it, the more people become calibrated to the idea that hope is everywhere and we can move forward together. So here's my contact information, also webpage. I want to reiterate how honored and humbled I am to be here, and thank you for this opportunity. And if you'd like to discuss anything around hope or the challenges we face around flooding, maybe there's some time for questions. So thank you so much.